That's Winnie, my brand new little granddaughter, and that's why I'm doing this.
Wow, isn't that something?
This is the whole stop, you know, stop what you're doing, and then that whole sort of nurturing, holding, trying to protect the next generation.
What a great picture.
Isn't she cute?
Yeah. Tell me about this world.
This is the Halliburton loophole. And this is injecting that awful stuff through the groundwater. Ooh. And this is Dick Cheney's mask. Just a thought. You know?
Wow. You got a totally different tool. It's great.
The stakes really are high. She's going to be a refugee by the middle of the century because her country's not going to exist anymore. We have to work very quickly, and the power of the opposition in terms of the fossil fuel industry is very large. So there's no guarantees that we're going to win.
It's bad. Problem is bad.
It is bad. I'm Marnie Stanton, and I've created a series of abstract sculptures to illustrate the complicated story of climate change. I have always used the creative process to sustain my balance. Because of that, I felt particularly fortunate to have been asked to join the Time Project. I was one of 10 artists that created one piece of art a week for 52 weeks. For my subject, I decided to follow the weekly environmental news with particular emphasis on global warming as affected by climate change.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
17 years ago, I moved to Martha's Vineyard. I had high hopes that my love of nature and need to be active could be put to good use. What I didn't count on were the much larger forces of nature that were bearing down and creeping into my consciousness. The whole island was in jeopardy and at risk of disappearing from high water, and too few people seemed to be concerned. Our species has lost its way, and its dangerous folly of manipulating our nest is causing untold changes to the Earth's balance in ways we can no longer predict or fathom.
And grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first.
On occasion, a few of us would gather to try and raise awareness about the threat of global warming, only to witness, at best, a puny response.
And we've been here 10,000 years, bright shine.
For 10,000 years, the world's climate has been remarkably stable. It has stayed virtually the same, about 57 degrees Fahrenheit for that 10,000 years. About 200 years ago, after 9,800 years or so of civilization, we learned to burn coal, then gas and oil. Whenever you burn fossil fuel, you release carbon in the form of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And this carbon dioxide, its molecular structure, traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space.
Carbon dioxide is the major heat-trapping gas. It's roughly 60% of the climatic disruption. Fossil fuels, that produces about 8.5 billion tons of carbon dumped into the atmosphere annually. Deforestation, that produces a net of about 1.5 billion tons of carbon dumped into the atmosphere annually. 5 billion tons of the total 10 billion tons of emissions stays in the atmosphere and constitutes the problem. Fusion of carbon into the oceans of the Earth amounts to about 2 billion of the 10 billion tons. That changes the chemistry of the oceans. It's absorbed first as a gas into the upper layers of the ocean, and then into the carbonate-bicarbonate system of the ocean. Changing the acidity is another chronic disturbance, similar to changing the temperature or any other environmental factor. All of the life of the Earth has been adapted to climates of the past over tens of thousands of years. So all of the life of the Earth is genetically fixed to that climatic regime. We've changed the climatic regime right out from under all of the life of the Earth.
So that amount of carbon in the atmosphere, which has been steady for the last 10,000 years at about 275 parts per million, began to climb 200 years ago, and it's climbed ever steeper. It's now about 390 parts per million in the atmosphere. 3 years ago, after the Arctic began its very rapid melt, our best scientists, a NASA team, published a paper saying, we know enough to say how much carbon in the atmosphere is too much. Anything more than 350 parts per million, they said, is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed or to which life on Earth is adapted. We've got to stop burning fossil fuel. That's the task, and a very hard task it is.
Our government is heavily controlled apparently by money, and they have virtually infinite money. And so they've had enormous power. They've been able to dominate the discussions nationally over the past 20 years, scurrilously undermining the science and promoting their own interests, not just the fossil fuel interests, but also the pesticide interests and all the allied interests that are tied in with cheap fossil fuel energy. They have systematically questioned the accuracy of the science behind the climatic disruption. And they've been successful in the public eye because our news media have listened to them and said, well, on the one hand, the scientists say, and on the other hand, the industries say, as though the industries were equivalent to the scientific community in making an appraisal of the seriousness of the problem. And when they've been caught wrong in their appraisals of science, they've said, well, we can't afford to do anything else. We have to do it this way for economic reasons. All lies.
Anybody who can understand, say that when they go to the doctor and the doctor says your cholesterol level is too high, you're going to have a heart attack, we all know how to react when that happens. You know, this is exactly the same, just on a planetary scale.
Melting of the Arctic ice, that's happening at a rate that exceeds even the most outrageous appraisals of 10 years ago. The experts are looking back over history and discovering that it happened previously, that the glaciers disappeared in a surprisingly short time. Greenland has 20 feet of sea level rise in its glaciers, and those glaciers are melting at really quite startling speeds. And of course it's happening also in the Antarctic, and there's another 20 feet in the West Antarctic ice sheet and another 20 feet or more in the East Antarctic, and so on around the world. The effects, we said 40 years ago, would be to warm the continental centers, and warming them, dry them out. And we're watching that now. We're watching drought hit every continent. We're watching agriculture be crippled, people having to migrate off the land.
Global warming has raised the temperatures just enough to cause an explosion of this hungry creature. Millions of acres of spruce trees are blackened and decimated by this tiny beetle that is only the size of a grain of rice. The 3 beetles on this stick are large to show the population explosion of the species.
Those are the effects of the warming of the Earth caused by human pollution of the atmosphere. It's as straightforward as that.
In some ways, the most interesting thing about fossil fuel was that it has allowed us to become the first of our species who have no practical need of our neighbors for anything. You know, if you have a credit card and a internet connection, you might never have to see anybody in the world again. And for a lot of people, that's kind of what's happened. We've concentrated our economic efforts on building bigger houses farther apart from each other. That's been how we've kind of defined the American dream, you know. And so it's good news that as we begin to confront these challenges, we're beginning to see that change. One of the best things that's happening in this country right now is the rise of the local food movement.
I think we have to have a massive program of shifting out of fossil fuels into renewable sources of energy. We could use wind power or solar produced electricity to split water and store energy as hydrogen and run cars on it, run anything on it. We could have a big hydrogen program. We could reduce the use of energy in the United States overnight by 20%.
I spend most of my life in motion around the world working with people who are taking action, who are doing things, who are out there trying. That gives me enormous hope.
In this country, there's this sort of myth that it's to be an environmentalist and an activist is kind of like an elitist thing. You either have to be young and idealistic or old and rich in order to do it. You don't have to be rich or young to be involved in this. You just have to really care and get out there and spread the word, because it's got to come from the grassroots. It's not going to come from our government. The human spirit needs hope, and without it, we wither and die. Our country is responsible for a great deal of the mess we find ourselves in today. This isn't a partisan issue. Wake up, America. It's happening, and we're running out of time and very quickly destroying the only home we have. For the sake of our children and grandchildren, unplug, get off the couch, and get out there and make your voices heard. Only together do we have a chance of stopping this madness. I'm going to give it to you. Here you go. That's for you. That's for you. Mom. This is your home. It's your home. Isn't that fun? This is where you live. You want to see where you live? You live right there. The world is all yours.